This week on The Inside Story, a wrongfully detained journalist in Russia heads to a closed-door trial, facing charges of espionage. Violence in Ecuador sends journalists seeking safety elsewhere after one of their own gets held up by gunpoint live on air. Plus, artificial intelligence and the challenges it poses for Americans who are heading to the polls this fall. Now, on The Inside Story, a free press matters.
Hi, I'm VOA Press Freedom Editor Jessica Dorit. Welcome to The Inside Story, a free press matters. With conflict, repression and censorship driving large numbers of media into exile, we speak with journalists on the front lines. From navigating gang violence in Ecuador, assassination plots targeting Iranian journalists on British and US soil, and repressive policies affecting Afghan media. We also hear from journalists who are finding support and a sense of community in exile. But first, we turn to Russia. A closed trial in a remote city, more than 1,400 kilometers from Moscow. Russia this week is set to put wrongfully detained American journalist Evan Gershkovich on trial for espionage charges seen widely as bogus. A reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Gershkovich has been in Russian custody since March 2023 on accusations that he, his employer and the US deny. Here's what the State Department says.
We have been clear from the start that Evan has done nothing wrong. He should never have been arrested in the first place. Journalism is not a crime. The charges against him are false, and the Russian government knows that they are false.
Gershkovich is one of two American journalists detained by Russia. The other, Alsu Kurmasheva, denies the charges against her too, including failing to register as a so-called foreign agent. A dual citizen who works for our sister network, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague, Kurmasheva has been denied US consular access and has not had a call with her children since her arrest. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine marked a dangerous new time for local and foreign journalists. The Kremlin has carried out a campaign of repression, including intimidation, threats, expulsions and arrests. For Ricardo Markin, Marcus Harton narrates this report.
After 12 years as a correspondent for the Spanish newspaper El Mundo in Russia, Javier Colas is back in Madrid, but not for pleasure. As of early June, Javier is the latest foreign correspondent to be expelled by the Russian government.
Foreign journalists have been under sanctions. We have had 3-month visas instead of 1-year visas, as we had before. I was on a blacklist of people whose visa was not renewed and who could not remain in the Russian Federation any longer.
Moscow claims these are not expulsions. In the case of Javier Colas, as they did with others, Russian officials blamed the visa denials on journalists who, they say, made errors on their applications. But in a Russia at war, there is no place for free journalism, only for the propaganda of what the Kremlin calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Emmanuel Grinspan of the Paris-based Le Monde says he was expelled in 2019 due to his critical articles about Putin's Russia in the run-up to the invasion. Since then, he monitors the complicated situation of colleagues inside the country.
From what I understand, it's impossible to do free reporting for a Russian journalist. You just get arrested and sent to jail.
For many foreign journalists, the pressure is greater due to Russia's foreign agents law. Analysts say the Kremlin uses the law to target critics, with some at risk of jail.
This is something that Russian journalists have lived with for quite literally the entirety of Putin's time in power.
Foreign journalists in Russia are becoming fewer and fewer, and independent Russian journalists have only 2 options: work underground at great risk or go into exile. a dark landscape that shows no signs of changing in the near future. For Ricardo Marquina, Marcus Harton, VOA News.
A violent start to the year in Ecuador has many of the country's journalists seeking safety outside its borders. After being held up at gunpoint live on air, journalist Jose Luis Calderon moved to Miami to escape an uncertain environment and to gain access to trauma support. Christina Caseda-Smith tells us his story.
With a gun to his neck, Jose Luis Calderon pleads with authorities not to enter the TC television studios. Footage of the live raid at the Ecuadorian public broadcaster earlier this year traveled around the world.
I had guns pointed at me at all times. They even put a carbine, the muzzle of a carbine, on my neck. An explosive also, some type of dynamite explosive in my jacket pocket.
The raid by alleged gang members during a live broadcast in Guayaquil City is a first for Ecuadorian media, and Calderon vividly remembers the moments that changed his life and those of his team.
My colleagues were emotionally devastated. Fathers and mothers who believed they were not going to return home to hug their children.
Even after police made arrests, Calderon remained uneasy. In Washington, Dag Martiel and her nonprofit Fundamedios monitor violations like the TC television case. In Ecuador, she says, media confront deteriorating rights and high risks, with threats from armed groups leading to silent zones or areas where reporters can no longer work.
It's a very dangerous work nowadays. Ecuador was a place where you could freely report, but being now a journalist, it's not easy anymore. In the last 1.5 years, we have reported 14 journalists that have decided to go into exile.
Among them is Calderon. Unable to get the support he needed to cope with his trauma, the journalist traveled to the U.S. to seek asylum.
I entered periods of anxiety and said, no, this can't be. And the truth is that I've got to get out of here.
Now Calderon is trying to adjust to his new life, away from his country, friends, and family.
I'm optimistic that things will go in my favor. Maybe someone will value my expertise in communication and journalism. And yes, I'm a little scared, worried because we are starting from scratch.
Calderon is safe, but Tiel says that back in Ecuador, threats to the media have an impact on society.
So what we are having is a lack of information, and yes, like in many other countries, the citizens that will not have information to know what's happening in their country.
Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa visited Calderon's newsroom after the raid, and Ecuador renewed commitments to press freedom, including setting up a protection mechanism. However, budget cuts mean such safeguards are not funded in the coming years. Cristina Caicedo-Smith, VOA News.
From assassination plots to stabbings, Iranian journalists are subject to intense risks. But as Tehran ramps up attacks on the diaspora news outlet Iran International, a team of lawyers are working with US officials to better coordinate responses to a tactic known as transnational repression. Here's Liam Scott.
Moving a 24/7 newsroom across an ocean nearly overnight is no easy task. But that's the situation the Washington-based team of Iran International found themselves in after a series of attacks on their London colleagues forced its British headquarters to temporarily close last year.
Their aim was to stop Iran International TV, and we couldn't let it happen. We had to do whatever we can to keep the channel on air.
Attacks against the broadcaster have been brash. Foiled assassination plots, a stabbing in London, and threats so serious that a reporter in Sweden moved to a safe house in June. Tehran is believed to be behind these incidents and more.
These kind of threats are increasing, unfortunately. And right now it is mostly targeting Iran International journalists, but there is no reason to believe that it will stop there.
Tehran is one of dozens of governments that engage in tactics known as transnational repression to silence critics outside their borders.
Iran for many years targeted journalists on its own soil. But what has started to develop into an industry on a huge scale in Iran has been transnational repression, targeting journalists outside the country, using the long arm of the state to try to silence journalists reporting.
Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not reply to VOA's email requesting comment. In Washington, the international legal team supporting Iran International is meeting with lawmakers, White House officials, and think tanks to raise awareness. A key issue, they say, is that governments tend to respond to attacks on their own.
And it's time that I think we catch up as states. We make sure that the governments are cooperating, that they're sharing knowledge.
For Iran International journalists, their families back home are also at risk of retaliation. Parpanchi says nearly all Iranian journalists he can think of have come under some form of pressure.
Threats can never become normal. No journalist should be subject to any kind of threats, specifically life-threatening threats.
Named after VOA Persian host Masih Alinejad, the United States already has a law imposing sanctions on those seeking to carry out Iran-backed attacks. But Gallagher is pressing lawmakers to take a more active role.
And were it not for brave journalists who, despite the risks, are telling us those stories, we simply wouldn't know what's happening within Iran. And that is something which should trouble every single American. And it's why we all must stand up for freedom of expression and for the right of journalists to do their job without fear.
While their lawyers look for long-term solutions to keep the team safe, Iran International's journalists continued their work, broadcasting to audiences inside Iran. Liam Scott, VOA News.
At a time of declining trust in media, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism has been investigating the factors driving the downward trend. From Oxford, Henry Ridgewell speaks with the Institute's director.
What are the major themes of global trust in news that you're detecting?
What we find is a tendency that as people rely less and less on television and more on social media, there is a tendency that this erodes trust in news in general. And our theory is that this is because increasingly people see news in a context where it's often contested by other people, or the people sharing it, or people commenting on it and the like. And in that sense, it comes across as less authoritative. When we turn to the question of why we're seeing these changes, part of it has nothing to do with journalism and news in particular. It's about what some scholars call the trust nexus, that when people are more skeptical of much of what is in the news, political institutions, businesses, civil society organizations, organized religion, they also tend to become more skeptical of the news. So in some parts of the world, there are individual politicians or major political parties who have made the press an enemy and explicitly and publicly, repeatedly attack journalism and news media. And over time, people who are sympathetic to those politicians or those parties are likely to take a cue from them and begin to think about journalism in a different way.
There is that cohort of people who, passively or actively, I suppose, are avoiding news consumption altogether. Are you able to identify ways in which journalists can reconnect?
People have lots of different reasons for avoiding the news, at least some of the time. Some of these can be very understandable. If you're in a sort of dark and difficult period in your time, you may not want to hear about bad things happening elsewhere in the world. Much of journalism has not historically been oriented towards the interests and needs and worldview of younger people, of women, and of people from less privileged backgrounds. So a starting point can be just taking people's identities seriously and make sure that their experience and their worldview and lives are represented, respected, and reflected in the news coverage. There is, I think, an important and necessary discussion in journalism about the question of whether traditional professional norms around objectivity and impartiality are always the right norms for every issue, or whether there are issues in which journalists need to or ought to take a stance and make clear where they stand and what the editorial line is on divisive issues and consequential issues of our time, climate, attempts to subvert election integrity. But we need to remember that much of the public does not recognize journalists as moral authorities, and basically want journalists to cover the news as neutrally as they can and leave it up to people to make up their own minds.
Journalists fleeing conflict and censorship often struggle to remain working in media. But in Kenya, a hub for exiled reporters is providing legal and immigration support. And, more importantly, it offers a way for them to keep working. From Nairobi in Kenya, Victoria Munga has more.
Isra Dawood's job in media came to an abrupt end in 2023 as a war erupted between rival factions in Sudan. The journalist fled her home in Khartoum.
We had to move from our house to another region because we stayed like for 10 days, but after that we started to hearing some news about women get kidnapped and get raped, and that was for us, it is frightening.
Arriving in Kenya last May, Dawood had to rebuild her life. Thanks to a media support program, she had a helping hand. An initiative between the German-based Media Incorporation and Transition, or MICT, and African partners helped enroll her in a hub for exiled media. She received a MICT fellowship that includes financial and legal help and safe working spaces for journalists affected by conflict in Sudan and East Africa. She also received training and connections to media outlets that can publish her work.
I wrote 3 articles, of course, under the supervision of the project. So I always, when I was sending the materials, sometimes they have small maybe comments that you should focus on this, you should write this. I think this a good learning process.
So far, the hub has helped at least 80 journalists globally, 15 of them in Kenya. A panel reviews and selects applicants.
The fellowship usually runs for about 3 to 4 months, and the holistic support structure consists of 7 concrete modules which are offered on an individual basis and include livelihood support, security considerations, mental and physical health support, integration and legalization offers.
Partners in the program, like the International Press Association of East Africa, or IPA, help by setting up press credentials and finding publications willing to pay for articles. They also provide working spaces.
This is basically a huge chunk of what we are trying to even continue more, and especially expanding to have this co-working space where people can come and even just brainstorm creative ways of doing things, new ways.
Conflict and repression are forcing hundreds of journalists to exile each year, say UNESCO.
You also have journalists who face political repression, legal harassment, censorship, risk of retaliation from criminal groups, or simply lack of job opportunities and weakening media landscape.
And in Sudan, UNESCO estimates over 8.5 million people have been displaced in the past year, including journalists like Dawood, who hope to return home soon. Until then, media hubs like this one offer support and some normalcy to those in exile. Victoria Amunga, VOA News, Nairobi.
This year, part of being an informed voter is knowing that when it comes to online video, seeing is not necessarily believing. Bad actors are using artificial intelligence to create disinformation in the hopes of swaying voters ahead of November's elections. Here's a look at how AI is being used in election 2024.
Artificial intelligence has already made an appearance in this election, as in this computer-generated photo of Donald Trump hugging infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci. And this fake robocall of Joe Biden telling New Hampshire voters to skip their primary.
We'll need your help in electing Democrats up and down the ticket.
The timing of electoral deepfakes is what makes them so dangerous, says media expert Elaine Kamark of the Brookings Institution.
Even 24 hours before the election, someone puts out a deepfake or a piece of disinformation. It's really difficult. It's really difficult to fight back. And that could, in a close election, it could make the difference between winning and losing.
Rajul Gupta's firm Deep Media helps the Pentagon detect deepfakes, which he says are popular because they are inexpensive and easy to produce.
End to end, it takes about 15 minutes to create a deepfake. There are many free services online. If you want to pay for some of the better ones, a 30-second audio clip is maybe 2 cents.
Attorney and free speech advocate Ari Cohen.
There's been a lot of talk about Russia, but China also, especially as they are fighting in the AI arms race to try and jump ahead.
Cohen says the most sophisticated overseas operations aim to place a piece of political disinformation with influential Americans for them to pass on to others. The biggest U.S. tech firms and social media platforms have promised some voluntary self-regulation of AI in political campaigns, but no federal laws currently govern the practice.
It's very, very difficult to regulate political speech in the United States. The First Amendment protects that core political speech very strongly, and for good reason. We don't want the government putting the hands on the scale, its finger on the scale of elections.
Gupta says much of that difficulty lies in distinguishing between something that is false and something that is a characterization of an issue with which one might not agree. So how are we to know when something is a political deepfake?
And the audio quality is bad, that is a hint that it could be AI generated. It might sound kind of silly or trivial, but actually just looking for those watermarks and being able to find those watermarks quickly in images, audio, and video can, again, filter out a lot. So if you're on a video call with someone and you think they're a deepfake, ask them to spin around in their chair. And if they don't, they might be a deepfake.
Cohen says AI can be used for good in politics. It can allow candidates to reach diaspora communities in their own languages. And it can give campaigns better insight into voter behavior, so they can better tailor their messaging. For Ivana Pitborska in Washington, Carolyn Prasuti, VOA News.
With opportunities for journalists limited since the Taliban returned to power, Farouk Tareen and her family left Afghanistan in pursuit of a better life. Now in Paris, France, the journalist wants to be a voice for those silenced in her home country. Here she is in her own words.
In school, I was interested in reciting poetry, hosting, and public speaking, and I was hosting events. I was encouraged by my teachers, family, and friends. They were telling me that I had the talent to become a journalist. Fortunately, I was one of the thousands of girls who could pursue their studies with the support of their families. With the changes in the country, my activities became completely limited. I was no longer allowed to participate in events and conferences, conduct interviews, cover demonstrations. I had to wear a mask. I was not allowed to enter an event. Exactly twice in my life, I have witnessed this situation. The first time was when I was a child under the Taliban. It took my childhood from me. With the Taliban coming to power in the 1990s, my mother, who was a second-year journalism student, could not continue her studies. The same situation has repeated. It was in March 2022 that we left Kabul secretly. After going through some administrative work, we came to France. It is disappointing when you study, work, and then are forced to leave the country. It is very difficult living outside one's country.
With the arrival of the Taliban, things become messed up. We had no freedom at all. There were so many restrictions that even a small thing that would air and was against their policy, even on social programs, would face harsh treatment. There was no hope for the future because there was no space to talk about arts, knowledge, and literature.
Afghanistan is going through the darkest days. Not only women, but all people are in a state of confusion and crisis. Journalists who leave Afghanistan, particularly those who then work with trans-border media, can help the people of Afghanistan. The first problem I am facing here is the language. We have economic problems. It is difficult, but we hope to achieve our goals. I want to be the voice of the people of Afghanistan and help them.
That's all for this week. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Inside Story. For the latest on press freedom, you can log on to voanews.com/pressfreedom. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News, and you can follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Jessica Jareed. Catch up on our past episodes at our free streaming service, VOA+. I'm Jessica Jareed. We'll see you next week for The Inside Story.